Hello, we are continuing the lecture on Chapter 2. This is Part 2 of 3 parts in order to keep the individual files at a reasonable number of minutes. We were talking about comparative criminologists and how they are moving more toward transnational crime as their area of focus. Certainly there are still very many people interested in domestic crime and comparing domestic crime in 2 different countries, but increasingly we see comparative criminologists and others expressing a greater interest in transnational crime. And when we are talking about transnational crime, it's important for us to distinguish it from another term, international crime. Sometimes the two are used interchangeably, but increasingly it's important to distinguish between the two because they are really getting at 2 different topic areas. International crime is generally seen as referring to acts that threaten the world order or security. And there are 3 types of international crimes today: crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. We won't have too much occasion to talk about these individually, although we will make reference to them in this chapter and probably later in the semester as well. And it's quite possible that you, in your discussion boards, might want to bring up some of these. And that's perfectly okay. It's just that when we're talking about transnational crime, we want to distinguish it from international crime. And as you can see here, transnational crime is referring to criminal acts that span national borders, violating the laws of several different countries. As we look at some of these examples of transnational crime, and you see several listed here, these are not all certainly, but a good representation of what transnational crimes would involve. You first of all see that there are several that are considered to be domestic crimes as well. Certainly illicit drug trafficking, money laundering, these things are activities that can occur and do occur within the confines of a national border. But when we're talking about these in the context of transnational crime, we're making reference to their involvement or the crossover between several different countries. So that illicit drug trafficking, for example, which is one that we'll be covering, or that you will be covering in the discussion boards, it's one of the 3 crimes that we'll be looking at as you lead the discussion board on these transnational crimes, the other 2 being maritime piracy and trafficking of persons. But illegal drug trafficking is certainly something that we have domestically, but when we're talking about in the transnational context, we are looking at how several countries might be involved, so that opium might be grown in one country, transferred to a different country, and then distributed in a 3rd country, and that would give it its transnational aspect. Maritime piracy and trafficking in persons, as I said, are 2 other transnational crimes, and we'll be seeing more about those later. Terrorism is highlighted here, and as we get a little bit further into this, I'm going to be talking more about terrorism as a specific example of a transnational crime. And then in the 3rd part of this Chapter 2 lecture, we're going to look at terrorism more specifically as well. We begin by just providing a general or a broad overview of the subject. Terrorism is something that is difficult to define. A lot of people are surprised by that. They sometimes think that it's a pretty straightforward kind of process, but we'll see that that's not necessarily true. The substantive law requires a crime to be defined and punished when to be specified, as you know from earlier chapters, and as we'll see more clearly as we get into Chapter 3 as well. And the question here is, what do you think would be some of the key features of the crime of terrorism? So if you were charged basically with coming up with draft legislation that would make terrorism a crime, think for a moment about what kind of things you would include in that substantive law. What kind of things are going to be identified as the definition? We won't worry so much about the punishment being specified at this point, just more what the definition is going to be. And one of the ways that I approach this in the classroom is to ask students whether Timothy McVeigh was a terrorist. You may recall that he killed 168 people. He was convicted of conspiracy to use weapons of mass destruction, the use of weapons of mass destruction, destruction by explosive, and 8 counts of first-degree murder. None of those, as you can see, are crimes of terrorism. There was, in fact, no conviction on terrorism at all in the federal courts in which he was tried. And this surprises quite a few people, because Timothy McVeigh is someone who oftentimes is cited, and rightfully so, I would argue, as a terrorist, but in fact there were no convictions on terrorism. And contrast that, if you will, with John Muhammad and Lee Malvo, who you may or may not recall. Very quickly, for those of you who have not heard of these two, they were charged in the deaths of individuals in what is the Washington, D.C. area, the Beltway. It encompasses not only the District of Columbia, but also picks up some of Maryland and Virginia and so on. And Muhammad and Lee Malvo were caught and charged with 13 deaths in at least 6 different jurisdictions in that District of Columbia area. They were found to have been hiding in the trunk of a car and shooting and killing individuals who were standing at gas stations, coming out of 7-Eleven type stores, convenience stores. And a very terrifying situation, as you can imagine, for those people living in this area, in the District of Columbia area, during the times of these killings. After the two were caught, Virginia was in fact the first to bring charges against both Muhammad and Malvo. And those charges included several counts of capital murder. And there was one based upon Virginia's new anti-terrorism law. And that law basically was saying that a murder defendant is eligible for capital punishment if the crime was intended to intimidate the public. Well, this was a very helpful law in finding both Muhammad and Malvo guilty, including the terrorism charge, because of that reference to intention to intimidate the public. So while a lot of people don't, and didn't then, still don't today, think of Muhammad and Malvo as being examples of terrorists, they were, and McVeigh wasn't, actually convicted of terrorism charges. And this, I think, is one way to highlight the difficulties of coming up with a crime of, or a definition of the crime of terrorism. Even in a particular country, we don't see a lot of agreement. In the United States, for example, the State Department says that terrorism means premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents intended to influence an audience, typically. The FBI, however, says that terrorism includes the unlawful use of force and violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof, in furtherance of political or social objectives. So one of the things that these two definitions have in common is political, and seeing political as being a key point in trying to understand terrorism. Other definitions, of course, also would include reference to politics in their definitions. An interesting aspect of this is some people believe that terrorism should actually be handled in the context of national security rather than in the criminal justice system, especially since reference to politics is so typically found. If that were to be true, of course, it would become more of a military, for example, obligation than a prosecutorial or local police obligation to respond to terrorist activities. And that's one of the reasons why definitions become important when looking at terrorism. When criminal charges are brought against terrorists, it's oftentimes for the violent acts that they committed rather than because of the crime of terrorism, going back to what we saw with McVeigh, for example. There are plenty of laws out there on which people who commit what we would call terrorist acts can be charged and convicted. And many would argue that we don't necessarily need to have a separate crime of terrorism because it's sufficient to bring charges against individuals for use of explosives, for murder, for other kinds of more typical crimes. Others would respond to that saying that, in fact, having a crime against terrorism is important for a variety of reasons, which may or may not necessarily include the ability to get particular charges brought against the individual, which might be done under other kinds of crimes. But instead, maybe there are some political reasons or social support reasons to have a crime against terrorism. That completes Part 2 of Chapter 2. Please move on to Part 3, and we will finish the discussion of terrorism and this chapter.